Welcome to the 10-Minute Treasure. My name is Jeff Pospisil, and I'm going to stray from my normal practical advice. At least I hope it's practical. And I'm going to dive into helping people understand this withdrawal liability for pension in the United Methodist denomination. So part of the reason I'm doing this is I was in a town hall earlier this week and tried to explain it, and I thought I did a good job, but one guy came up to me today and said, "Hey, I have no idea what you're talking about." So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes to try to explain what I failed at last time. This pension liability issue, it's a fairly new thing for us. This is the legislation you see before you, 1504.23. It was passed at the 2019 special session of the General Conference. And this is the same General Conference that made it so that churches could disaffiliate if they disagree with the denomination on homosexuality. So that is 2553, a separate but related piece of legislation. So this one, like I said, it's not the same as the disaffiliation process. And you could see the words in front of you. I'm going to try to put them in my own words, which may or may not help. If a church closes or leaves the United Methodist denomination, they owe their share of the conference's unfunded pension obligation. The amount of the obligation is determined by Westpath, and the church's share is determined by the conference. And I'm going to go ahead and dive into this a little bit deeper. The first question I have is, when is it due? That's not said in this legislation, and there's really only one where it does say when it's due. That's 2553. So if a church disaffiliates that way, it's due at the time you sign that agreement. So at the time that the church disaffiliates. What complicates this legislation is that it includes closing churches. And I'm a conference treasurer. I've seen a lot of churches close. And almost all of them close because they don't have enough money. Almost all of them. And so now, are we saying that a church can't close unless it pays its pension liability? And when does it pay it? Does it pay it when at the charge conference where it votes to close, or at the last worship service? Do they hand a check off to the conference? That's usually not the case. Normally they don't have the assets, and the only way they're going to have the assets is if they sell the building. And then what makes it even more complicated, this happens to be a picture of the Oldham United Methodist Church. Thanks to Bruce Bloomer, by the way, who keeps pictures on his website, and I'm going to put a link to that because I think it's cool. Anyway, this building, I sold it for the price of its bell. So I told somebody they could have the bell, the church bell, if they agree to take the lot, tear down the building, and fill in the hole. So that was that. So are we supposed to keep them active just because they can't pay the pension liability? So what does that mean? So first of all, it's obviously not due on the day that the church closes if they have to later sell the building. So what does that mean for churches that are leaving not under 2553? Is it due exactly at that time they vote to leave? Well, that's not the case for closing churches. What if they can't pay? What if they actually don't have the resources to pay, like a church like Oldham? So those are just questions that come to my mind. So I don't think it's due at the time that you leave because of this question, and I have some uncertainty that it's due if you don't have the ability to pay. The next question, which is probably the bigger question, is what is this unfunded pension obligation? Are you saying that our denomination isn't fully funding our pension? So this is the slide that actually led to this video. I shared this at the town hall. I thought it would make sense of this whole pension liability thing, but apparently it doesn't. So I'm going to go through this really quickly, and then I'm going to give you an analogy that will hopefully help this make a little bit more sense. So first of all, the pension liability, that is the liability, the debt we owe to cover the years of service that our pastors have put in. That's as simple as I could put it. And it can be calculated different ways. One of the ways it can be calculated is as if we are going to continue to fund it. And so they call that the funding liability. And for the Dakotas UMC, our liability is $60 million. So that's our pension liability under the funding way of calculating it. But there's another way to calculate it, and it's called the market liability. So if we were to close shop and sell this pension obligation to somebody, what would we have to pay him? And that's roughly $90 million. So that's about a 50% increase in our liability. And this line up here, by the way, that happens to be the amount of pension assets we have. So we have about $90 million in pension assets and a market liability of about $90 million. So what Westpath uses is 110% of market. And I think that's to account for some of the variability, like the pension liability, it'll fluctuate over time. It goes up and down depending on certain assumptions on market returns, as well as your assets are going up and down at the same time. So anyway, that was what I shared in a nutshell. All right, so here is my analogy. And let me know, by the way, if this makes sense or if you have a better analogy. I'd love to hear it. This is such a difficult subject that I think some of our conversations are lacking just because we don't understand it. And if we can help people get their minds wrapped around this, maybe we could have better conversations about it. So imagine you have a grown child that wants to move home, and I got a spare room. Now, I'm a cheap accountant, so imagine you're a cheap accountant too. I'm going to charge them rent because nobody that's a grown up besides my wife is going to live in my house without paying rent. So I'm going to charge them $60 a month. This is the funding liability. This is a lower rate than what I would charge maybe a stranger, but it's still not nothing. So now imagine instead I rent that out to a stranger. You know, I kind of make sure they're good for it, and I charge them what I think the market rate is, what the going rate is. So that's the market liability. It's going to be a higher rate because I don't have that ongoing relationship with them. I don't know them quite as well, so there is a little bit more risk. Now, imagine instead I rent it out to somebody I don't trust, somebody that I think will probably break their word. They just are not a little bit sketchy in their character. If I still decide to rent out my room to them, I'm going to charge them that even higher rate. I'm going to charge them maybe $100 a month. So this would be the funding rate, the market rate, and that 110% of the market rate. So now let's add those pictures to this graph and see if that makes a difference. So what Westpath is doing, and I think it's proper because of their fiduciary duties, is they are calculating that amount based on the churches that are leaving that we cannot count on their word. And again, think of that. Their obligation is to those people that have earned the pensions, the retirees. And so that's where their duty lies. So this amount here is non-negotiable. But there are other terms such as when is it due? You know, is it due on the date that they leave, or can it be paid in installments, or can we accept a promissory note? Those kind of terms there's a little bit more flexibility in there. And conferences like the Dakotas, where we're not really going to be like family with those that leave. We're going to kind of be like second cousins maybe. So we're not strangers, we're not family, we're somewhere in the middle here. But we can do favorable terms, not as good as if you were staying in the family, but not as bad as if we didn't know you or if you were our enemy. And there's going to be some conferences where churches leave and there's a lot of animosity, and their terms are going to be, hey, you owe the money when you leave. And that's going to be, I'm not going to say that's wrong to do because they know their situation better than I do. But it is going to be a little bit different from conference to conference because of that relationship. The last thing is, how is the church's share calculated? This is left up to the conference, and it's an important decision that I think sometimes we take the easy way out. So now remember that the pension liability is related to the years of service of those that have served our churches. And that there's more nuance to that, but roughly the years of service that a pastor put into a church. So there's probably three main ways that conferences are splitting up the liability. Some are just using the apportionment formula. You know, a lot of apportionment formulas, they use membership, they might use expenses or income. And I'm going to say I think that is wrong. Partially, here's the deal. You might have two churches, both served by one pastor. Maybe they've almost always been served by one pastor. One church has 1,000 members, one has 200 members. Why would one church's liability be 5 times that of another church? That doesn't make sense, especially if it's tied to the pastor. So I just don't think that's the right way. I think that's lazy. The other way, and this is a little bit more work, but it's to tie it to the pension direct bill. So this is the bill that a church gets for their pastor for the pension each month. And conferences that use this, I would guess a lot of them use maybe 10, 15, maybe 20 years worth of data. But when I look at that, I still don't think this is accurate enough, because I got a number of retirees that have been retired for 20, 30 years. I mean, so what about their liability? Or what about a church that maybe for 5 of those years they had a pastor, that period, but not for the rest. They didn't have someone on pension. So there's a gap there. And I don't think that's all the way appropriate either. I think the most appropriate way, and this is the way the Dakotas is going, so I'm a little bit biased, is years of service. So what I do is I grab the reports from Westpath. Here's the total years of service for our retirees. Here's the total years of service for our actives. And this is not a perfect system, by the way. And then I look at local churches who serve them. And are they still alive? Do they have a spouse that's still on the pension plan that's still alive? And then one of the things is people won't argue as much about that. I mean, they might argue, again, just the arguments I just gave you real quickly about apportionments and pension direct bill, but this is related to the years of service. And this is related to, you remember Pastor so-and-so. This is to help fund their pension from when they were with you, and Pastor so-and-so, and whatever. Anyway, I like that, but it's a hard work because you got to dig into the data, and you got to see if people are still alive. So, but that's the way we chose to go. All right, like I said, this is probably not the most practical video unless you're looking at getting into a discussion on pension liabilities, but hopefully it's a help, and God bless you until next time.